Hey, I looked into Islamic banking and it looks like smoke and mirrors to me. You took everything from conventional banking, you crossed out the word interest, and you wrote down the word profit. But the very act of creating money in the act of lending, credit creation, that's money creation. And that's not allowed in Islam. Human beings have suffered greatly because of lending, financiers who lend at interest because of interest. It's a great evil that's been recognized for thousands of years. More debt, more cheap money, more inflation, another crash. Borrow, spend, consume. This is the cycle that we now live in. Financialization is an evil. And I'm telling you that I thought that I could change it from within that environment, but it is just fundamentally rotten. Fiat money has led to the greatest mechanized murder of people on the planet in history.
Assalamu alaikum, Khawateen and Hazrat. Welcome back to another episode of Thought Behind Things. Today we have a very special guest with us. Before मैं उनको introduce कराऊं, I have to say I will be having this conversation completely in English, so I do apologize for that. I know आप में से काफ़ी सारे लोग जो हैं वो बड़े परेशान होते हैं कि यार उर्दू में आप नहीं बात कर रहे. But my guest is joining me all the way from London, and he's most comfortable in English as well. This is someone I've been a huge fan of over the last year. Incredible thoughts, and I just thought, if we can have him on and he could explain some of those concepts to you, I think, it would be a privilege for me and for you guys as well. I sent him a cold text. I never thought he would reply, but he was, gracious enough to accept the invitation. Today we have with us Irfan, who is one of the leading Islamic finance bankers. He was previously the global head of Islamic finance at Barclays Group. Before that, he co-founded Deutsche Bank's world-leading Islamic finance team. Currently, he is the managing partner and founder of Cordoba Capital. If I've pronounced that correctly, Haris, thank you so much for being part of the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And thank you also for agreeing to conduct the interview in English. I'm afraid my Urdu is very, very rusty and I would just embarrass myself.
That's perfectly all right. You are originally from Pakistan or?
Yeah, my heritage is Pakistani. My father came to the UK in 1960.
Oh, wow. One of the, probably one of the earliest ones.
Earliest pioneers, yeah.
So I'm going to start this conversation. I noticed today, actually, I just found out you actually wrote a book, Heaven's Banker Inside the Hidden World of Islamic Finance. Run me through what was that book about and how was that experience?
Sure. It's really, it's a history of what happened about 20 years ago, because that was an inflection point for Islamic finance, the industry globally. And the reason was because I had been transferred by my then employer, who was Deutsche Bank, from London to Dubai. And I was the first Deutsche Banker on the ground. And they asked me to open the office and originate new transactions for the bank from there. And when I arrived, a lot of prospective clients of ours said, we would like you to do these deals on a Shariah compliant basis. And we didn't know what that was. And so we learned at the feet of the scholars. In fact, we hired probably what was the world's most important scholar, most well-known, a guy called Sheikh Hussein Hamid Hasan, who is essentially the architect of the products that we put together. And he's known as the grandfather of modern Islamic finance. So, a very key player in the industry for many, many years. And actually what we did at Deutsche at that time was just revolutionary. The Islamic finance market had been sort of a sleepy backwater for many years, producing, a few products here and there. But all of a sudden, this, what they called flow monster, Deutsche Bank was one of the world's leading investment banks, turned up and just turned it on its head. So I co-founded the Islamic finance team at Deutsche, and we started doing things that had never been done before. So you may have heard of things like sukuk, which means an Islamic bond, which is a type of financing instrument. And we started to do these on a very large multi-billion-dollar basis to acquire companies and finance airlines and finance governments and so on. And so we really developed and invented a new market. So I decided to document the living history as a primary source in this book, Heaven's Bankers, to show what was possible in the industry and what went wrong, because things did go wrong. And I'm afraid that what the bankers did was abusive to the industry. And we can talk about that in some detail as we go on. But essentially, it's a documentation of that process.
Interesting. And this was basically the boom that was happening in the Middle East as well. Dubai was really coming up, and a lot of other capitals in the region were also really beginning to develop themselves. Were you dealing with just Dubai, or were you all across the MENA and beyond region?
So our remit was global, and we were producing financial product that could be bought by customers in the US, the UK, anywhere in the world. But Dubai was the epicenter of that revolution. And that's because we were able to attract a lot of expats with strong technical skills. Some of them were, credit traders. Some of them were equity derivative structurers. Some of them were, so very many different disciplines within an investment bank suddenly converged in Dubai with these very technical skill sets. And they applied their ability to solve complex puzzles to a Shariah compliance setting. So it was really puzzle solving.
And originally, I mean, you mentioned earlier, you said, a lot of this became very abusive in the later years. Do you think the core foundation of the Sharia compliance or the Islamic banking was flawed to begin with? Or do you think it started with in the right direction, but really eventually lost its way?
Well, I tell you what, I think that when people like me started arriving in Dubai, in the DIFC, the Dubai International Financial Center, we had this vision of what we wanted to try and achieve. And that vision was a good vision. I mean, we were ideologically driven. We were actually young, practicing Muslims. We believed in the concept of an Islamic economic model. We felt that an Islamic finance industry was a good thing because it was ethical finance. And we actually, we wanted to do the right thing. And we thought we could do that from within a conventional banking environment, because of course banks are the dominant player in global finance. So if you work with a really heavy hitter like Deutsche Bank and you invent a new division within that, which is called Islamic Finance, and you invent new products and you've got the right people who are technically capable, they're kind of motivated, dynamic, hardworking, young, and they're ideologically driven, we felt that we could make a difference. And we initially started that way. I mean, we really were trying to create financial product that aligned with the ethical principles of Quran and Sunnah. But in time, I have come to realize that it's pretty much impossible to change the economic model from within an inherently flawed system. You cannot create Islamic finance on top of conventional finance. You have to separate, and you have to do it in parallel. It's a system that needs to develop away from conventional finance for reasons that I can explain.
Makes sense. If I come back a little bit, and let's talk about Islamic finance then, because you said you can't really evolve out of the current system. You actually have to create something alternatively. For Pakistan, for example, and across the region, we're now beginning to hear all about Islamic banks, Sharia compliant banks, and people get really, really confused because to me, very honestly, and this was not like this a few years ago, but most recently, it seems like you're really selling the same thing, just to rebranded it in a different way. If the bottom line is the same, then it doesn't really matter what the paper says. This is backed by some asset, or you're going to do this, and based on that, you're going to rent it, and the numbers are the same. More often than not, actually, in Pakistan, a lot of the Sharia compliant banks have been, have not been passing down the interest, that let's say the state bank has. So now the profitability has actually increased. So even the depositors are at the losing end, and the bankers are basically making great bucks. And so to me, it doesn't seem like there's any difference. But I want to really sort of roll back and ask you, how do you define conventional banking / conventional economic system, as you'd put it, and Islamic banking, Islamic finance, or Islamic economic model? Because you did mention ethical considerations, but what other things are there?
Okay. So one of the other reasons I wrote the book was because, and this is going back sort of 10, 12 years now, was because a lot of family and friends essentially said the same thing as you, which is, hey, I looked into Islamic banking and it looks like smoke and mirrors to me. It's like you took everything from conventional banking, you crossed out the word interest, and you wrote down the word profit. And you charge me the same. Actually, sometimes you charge me more. So what's so ethical about that? And I agree. I think that there's a problem there. but not because the numbers are the same. That's not the reason why I have the problem. Because actually, one is allowed to make a profit in Islam. You're allowed to be a trader. You're allowed to earn profit in a halal and ethical way. You're allowed to spend your money any way you see fit, as long as it's halal. Right? There's no sin in being profitable and rich and wealthy, but there's goodness in distributing that wealth and spreading money throughout the economy, called money velocity. This is a good thing for society. Everybody levels up together. But the problem that I have is not that the numbers are the same, that the profitability can be the same. It's that the fundamental basis on which Islamic banks operate is problematic. And I explain why. I think the phrase Islamic banking is an oxymoron, meaning that they're mutually incompatible. A bank, by definition, is an entity that takes in deposits and lends out money. Now, people think that it lends out what it takes in as deposits. That's not true. Actually, a central bank regulates the banks so that they may take in deposits, but only as reserves. They are allowed to lend a much higher number than they take in as reserves. So if they have 100 in reserves, they can lend 1,000. In fact, it can be an even higher number than that. Some countries don't have any reserve ratio. So you have this situation where a bank is an institution that has the legal right to create money from nothing. Imagine this. You took 100 in deposit, you lent 1,000. Where did 900 come from? It was invented from thin air. And people find this a very strange thing. You know, if a Martian landed on this planet and examined what banks do, the Martian would reasonably conclude, this is a form of fraud. How are you perpetuating a fraud on people? Where did you create new money from? The reality is banks are in the process, are in the business of creating money from nothing. So this is inherently a morally fraudulent transaction and inherently not Islamic, not Shariah compliant. You can't create money from nothing. Money is something that is used as a medium of exchange and cannot be invented from nothing. It requires something to qualify as money. And we'll go into what that is. So here we have a situation where Islamic banks are essentially regulated in the same way as conventional banks. In other words, they have the power to create new money in the act of lending. And yet, you're not allowed to do that in Islam. So what they do is they put halal contracts as an overlay on top of this banking business model. And they say, because our contracts are, and they use Arabic words like musharaka, mudaraba, wakala, istisna, etc. And you think, oh, okay, it's halal. A scholar said this is halal because it's wakala, because it's musharaka, because it's mudaraba. Fine, they rubber stamp it and they say it's fine. But the very act of creating money in the act of lending, credit creation, that's money creation. And that's not allowed in Islam. So it's a paradox. And it's an oxymoron, Islamic banking. I think Islamic finance should be based on a purer Islamic economic model. So Allah says in the Quran that He has made trade halal for us and riba haram for us. And people say, what is riba? Well, very simplistically, riba is interest. But actually, riba has a much wider definition that is quite technical, in fact. And I'm not going to go into the great detail of that, and the Mufti can explain that better than I can. But riba is essentially, the word means surplus or excess. Any excess of money on money is riba. Now, there's a famous hadith in which 6 items are named as things that can be used as money. They're not necessarily all the things that can be used as money, but they are named as gold, silver, wheat, barley, dates, and salt. And the hadith says that you may only exchange these at spot, hand to hand. In other words, I can't give you 100 pieces of silver and say, I want 110 pieces of silver back, because then I've created 10, which are riba. And the same applies to dates, wheat, barley, but by extension to anything that could become money, or could become a medium of exchange, or could become inventory even. So riba is really an excess, and it essentially is something that is unethical because it creates an asymmetric relationship between a borrower and a lender. Islamic economics is about creating symmetric relationships between parties so that we share risk. as you know, if you borrow money from a bank and you fail to make your payments and you default on your payments, then the bank can take extra security. It can repossess the asset that it was financing, or your house, or your business, or whatever it is. Are they really taking risk? Do you think that when a banker is evaluating the acquisition of another company, that he's really taking risk on that acquisition? Or is he saying, it doesn't matter because I'll get my money back, so I don't need to do a lot of due diligence on this? What if you had an economic model in which a financier, and I'm not going to use the word banker now, in which a financier was incentivized and effectively forced to do extra careful due diligence on whatever it was that he or she was financing? And they had to go into the nth level of detail to ensure that this is a good quality investment that they are making. Notice that I said the word investment. They're no longer lending money. They're making an investment as a partner in something. So, and now let's use the ideal model of an Islamic financier following the Islamic economic model. That individual is somebody who must act as a partner in an investment. So they say, okay, you have a business. I'm going to conduct due diligence on your business. I'm going to make sure that it's a high quality business. I'm going to evaluate the management. I'm going to evaluate your customers, your suppliers, your market. I'm going to do scenario analysis. I'm going to make sure the business model is a really good one before I decide to invest my and my customers' money. And then we are going to share the profits or losses on an equitable basis. So we can decide upfront what that ratio is. It could be 50-50, it could be 90-10, it could be whatever we determine between us, as long as we know upfront, there's no uncertainty. So now I've entered into, number one, a real economy transaction, which means that it's underpinned by a real trade or a real asset, and I've evaluated your business carefully. I haven't just said, you know what, I'll look at your financial statements. Are you a good credit or a bad credit? Here's some money, give me some money back with interest. I don't really care what happens in between. No, instead, as a financier, an Islamic financier, I should be saying, I've done extra careful due diligence on you. I like what you do. I decide to invest in you, and I want a careful monitoring of all the trade activity that you do with the money that I give you. And then I want to split the profits at the end. So A, it's real economy, and B, it's risk sharing. It's profit sharing. I'm not saying give me 10% back. Come hell or high water, I don't care if you do well or you do badly, I want my money back, and I'm going to repossess your house if you don't. No, the financier is saying, I will share in your profits or losses. I'm aligned with you. I'm incentivized with you. That means I have to make sure that you are performing well, and I will give you help to perform well. This is a very, very different paradigm, a different model. We do not have a relationship.
I understand. But if I were to sort of, actually, let's take it step by step. Question number one. For a lot of people, when they're looking at, stuff like interest, or they go around and they think, okay, so Islamic finance is something that is inherently a spiritual thing, and I'll make God happy if I don't get the house on mortgage, and so I just build cash and then go and buy something. But unfortunately, you're now living in a system where, especially in the Western world, it's increasingly impossible to buy your car on cash, buy your house on cash, because the system is such that nobody really can afford a house. And so they drive the prices of the house up because everybody is loaning it, right? So you're the one who's on the losing end if you're waiting to sort of save the cash for it. But so a lot of people are either say, it's a system, I can't be out of the system, so what do I do? And the second thing that they think is, the system is working and it's giving you great development, and it's great. It's look at the West, they're doing so great. So clearly, this is a better system. Islamic finance was primitive, it was old, it was for a different time. But then based on what you just said, makes me feel like, if there was Islamic finance involved, the 2008 crisis would never have happened, where even you disconnect the real economy from the sort of, numbers economy, and you keep on building products on top of that and start selling it. It's at some point, it does crash. And so I want to understand, is Islamic finance just this, idea that is great for you spiritually for the hereafter, or does it have roots within the structures of the global finance that, if you look at it in a long enough timeline.
Yeah, I'm smiling as you say this because there's so much to unpack in what you just said. And we need a week to discuss it. So I'm going to try and compress it into 5 minutes. Where shall I start? The first thing I will say is ancient wisdom is always more valuable than contemporary thought. So let's now talk about specifics. Keynesianism is a form of economics that has been dominant for the past 100 years or so. And sometimes we refer to neoliberal economics. Sometimes we refer to other schools of thought. We call things like Chicago School of Economics. We talk about financialization, which is the proliferation of debt and financial services in society, which became more prevalent post, I guess, the 1950s, but especially post the 1980s, after Reaganomics and Margaret Thatcher and so on. So we live in an era of cheap money. And let's take another step back. Let's talk about ancient wisdom. I think it's not unfair to ask the question, so what if people 2,000 years ago said this was a good form of economics? We live in a modern society. We have mobile phones and silicon chips, and, we process transactions from one side of the world to the other in a matter of milliseconds. What use is a form of economics that was invented 1,400 years ago, or maybe even 5,000 years ago? Well, again, I come back to this idea of ancient wisdom being very valuable. And sometimes we forget that in a modern society where everything happens very fast and trends happen very fast. From one day to the next, we don't know what gender we are anymore. So, this is a relatively recent phenomenon. And I think that if we go back to the roots of what ancient wisdom says about money and economics, we'll find some things in scripture, not just Islamic scripture, but also Christianity and also other religions, Abrahamic finance, you might even call it, in which we see that over a long period of time, human beings have suffered greatly because of lending, because of financiers who lend at interest, because of interest. It's a great evil that's been recognized for thousands of years. And it's really in the last 100 years that it's accelerated beyond all recognition. So we now have a situation where, as you said, young people can't afford to buy a house. In my parents' day, one person in the household was the breadwinner. The father earned, the mother brought up the children, and households were able to afford their monthly bill. And I'm talking obviously about the developed world because there are different models there compared to the rest of the world. But, certainly in the developed world, they were one-income households. And then over time, over the last 50 years, they become dual income and even more people in the household earning money just to keep afloat. Why is that? Because they're all servicing debt. Why are they servicing debt? Because we have cheap money. How do we have cheap money? Well, in 1933, President Roosevelt expropriated the gold of U.S. citizens. And essentially this was a form of theft. So gold was taken away from private citizens and into public ownership. And then in 1971, there was the final nail in the coffin of sound money, which is when Nixon removed the gold peg that underpinned the US dollar. So then the US dollar became essentially meaningless. The dollar became a fiat currency. Fiat means by decree. Something is decreed to be currency by a government. So all money that we use in the modern world, whether it's euro, yen, rupee, dirham, pound, dollar, these are all fiat currencies. Governments say this is the currency. What does it mean when you remove a gold peg from a currency? It's no longer backed by anything that has value. And now the dollar can be whatever the government deems it to be. So if the government keeps on printing new money, and sometimes they give it fancy names like quantitative easing, but essentially it's printing money. As long as they keep printing money, they are inflating the money supply. When you inflate the money supply, you flood the market with new dollars. What does that mean? Each dollar is worth a little less. Every new dollar that comes into circulation, you've reduced the value of dollars. You've diluted the value of dollars. What does that mean? Inflation. It means goods and services become more expensive. They become so vastly more expensive that now you need 2 people in the household to support a family's expenses, not 1. Now young people can't afford to get on the housing ladder because houses have become so expensive, inflated by cheap debt that makes them more and more expensive because rich people can borrow more debt. This is the irony, right? If you're poor, you can't afford to borrow debt. It'll cost you too much. If you're rich, you can borrow as much as you want, right? And the housing stock has inflated in value because of inflation. It's a double whammy. So now you have the stock of housing is just too expensive for young people to get on the ladder. And it's a never-ending crisis. Eventually, there'll be another crash. This is what happens with fiat money and financialization. More debt, more cheap money, more inflation, another crash. Go back to the beginning. More debt, more cheap money, more inflation, crash. Borrow, spend, consume. Borrow, spend, consume. This is the cycle that we now live in for the past, well, since the 1980s at least. Financialization is an evil, right? And I say this as a former investment banker. I come from that background. I'm an insider. I know exactly how it works. And I'm telling you that I thought that I could change it from within that environment, but it is just fundamentally rotten to the core. So you have this situation where, some people will say, okay, but a little bit of interest is good because we need credit. We need to be able to finance things, right? I think that let's for a second leave aside the fact that we live in an economy where debt is necessary because goods and services have so inflated beyond our means that we have to borrow. Why do we borrow in the first place? Why do we not have an economic system in which it is very difficult to inflate prices of goods and services? Pakistan is a very good example of that. Pakistan has been to the IMF, I don't know how many, 20 times or so? Right, 24 times. And each time it gets poorer. And each time the IMF says, well, if you do this and you do this and you do this and you introduce austerity and more taxes and you create more burden on people and you make people more oppressed and poorer, then, we'll give you some money to bail you out. And each time they get poorer. You would have thought that we would have learned by now, right? That 24 times later, we get poorer each time the IMF says they're going to bail us out, right? I think there is a solution, but it's a solution that's so radical that at this point I lose people, right? So I was a believer in the gold standard. I was a believer in a form of money that is commodity-backed, that is solid, that is chemically durable across time and space, that has been used for 5,000 years as a medium of exchange and a store of value. So it has historical precedent. And it's scarce. It's finite. You can't magically produce more of it, even though alchemists have tried in history. They haven't succeeded. You have to mine it from the ground. It requires energy and work. Proof of work is required to extract it from the ground. These are all characteristics of what is known as sound money. And for many years, it did act as a sound money until it was stolen by the US government, until it was centralized by the US government, until it has become manipulated by large institutions. And it's also impractical because one cannot do a multi-billion dollar transaction and send money halfway across the world in an instant, in a fraction of a second with gold, because it's big and heavy and it requires transportation and so on. I can't go to local groceries and pay for my groceries in gold coins because it'll be a fraction of a coin and I can't cut up gold coins. So it's impractical. Is there an alternative that is also scarce, finite, divisible, electronically transferable, fungible, meaning that one unit of that currency is the same as another unit of a currency? Diamonds, for example, can't be used as currency. Why not? Because one diamond is not the same as another diamond, right? They're not fungible. Whereas a dollar is fungible. $1 is the same as another dollar. Gold is fungible. One piece of gold that weighs the same and has the same purity is the same as another of the same weight and purity. These are fungible types of currency. So scarce, finite. What's the other major thing that we need for a sound money? Proof of work. The dollar does not have proof of work. What do I mean by that? It takes no energy for the US government to print dollars. That's why they flooded the market with trillions of dollars in the last few years. There's been a massive inflation of the money supply. In Pakistan, we may think that the dollar is a very sound currency because our rupee has been devaluing over so long that we say, well, the rupee is a terrible currency, the dollar is a hard currency. It would be great if we could use the dollar. Obviously, you can't in Pakistan. But we have this idea that the dollar is a sound currency. But actually, the truth is the opposite. If you held $100 in the year 1900, by the year 2000, those $100 are worth only $4 in real terms after inflation. Your dollar has devalued 96% in 100 years. It's a massive devaluation that is now accelerating because of the inflation of the money supply in order to address crises like depressions and recessions and COVID and this and that, and financing wars, by the way. You will notice that since 1971, when Nixon removed the gold peg to finance the Vietnam War, the US has been in a perpetual state of war ever since then, because it can finance it by stealing the wealth of citizens through inflation, by devaluing money, by increasing the money supply. It's an excellent way to finance war, and that's why they've been in this perpetual state of war. So fiat money is evil. Fiat money leads to mass slaughter. Fiat money has led to the greatest mechanized murder of people on the planet in history in the last 100 years, and the greatest environmental pollution in history in the last 100 years. What if we had a form of money that had all the characteristics of sound money, scarce, finite, proof of work? You need to extract it from something. It requires energy to do so, because that's what makes it a good form of money. And I came up with the answer. I was delivering a lecture in 2017, and I was doing my usual lecture on Islamic finance. And somebody in the audience asked me, what do you think about Bitcoin? So here's where I'm going to lose some of your audience, because there are many strong opinions about Bitcoin, especially from scholars, by the way, which I'm happy to get into. And I said, I'm sorry, I really don't know much about Bitcoin. Can you explain it to me? And he said, okay, it has this characteristic and that characteristic. And he explained it to me. And this is kind of real time in the Q&A session in the audience. And I said, wait, wow, so you're telling me it's like gold? He says, yeah, it's like gold, but it's better than gold because it's electronic. It's transferable in milliseconds from one person to another. It's peer-to-peer. That means it doesn't require an intermediary like a bank. That means you and I can trade something using Bitcoin immediately without requiring 19 intermediaries. By the way, whenever you make a transaction on your card, your ATM card or your credit card, there are 19 intermediaries that need to be paid in that process. It's a highly inefficient process, modern banking. Bankers always get their cut. There's 19 people in that chain who need to get their cut. Bitcoin is peer-to-peer. Me and you, we can trade something. That's the beauty of it. So he explained all these characteristics to me, and I said, oh, okay, I didn't know anything about Bitcoin, but I'm going to have to go away and research this. And I did. And I came to the conclusion that the characteristics of Bitcoin are better than gold, which is why I now consider it to be the most ethical and Islamic form of money ever invented. And at that point, people lose their minds. Okay? Half of them say, yeah, I'm on board with this. I love this. This is fantastic. I didn't know this. And then half the people say, Wallahi haram. Wallahi, this man has lost his mind. He's munafiq or something. He's going to go to hell.
Probably has a Bitcoin course and is trying to double that.
Right, exactly. So it's a tough conversation to have with people because it's a very controversial.
Let's break this down a little bit before we move to Bitcoin. I want to understand So we've established that fiat, based on the fundamentals of Islam, would be inherently un-Islamic because someone somewhere is just basically multiplying and creating money out of thin air, and so that just it goes against the core tenet of Islam. Was it the same pre-1971 when currency was pegged to gold? Or rather, if I were to flip it, let's assume in October in the Kazan summit, BRICS comes out with, let's say, a BRICS currency, and it's backed by bricks of gold. Suddenly they provide an alternative and talk about it, create an entire narrative of how, the US quack economy has really sort of, the imperial US empire has taken over the world through their financial system. And so now we are coming up with a currency that is more rooted in fundamentals. And we saw, India and Saudi and China has been hoarding gold over the last many quarters, while simultaneously dumping US treasuries.
Yeah.
If we see such an alternative currency emerge, would you consider that to be more Islamic, or would you consider that to be the same of, what we already have?
So a lot of Muslims will argue that gold and silver, bimetallic currency, are the only valid Islamic forms of money. And then they refer to that hadith that I mentioned, in which 6 items are mentioned: gold, silver, dates, barley, wheat, salt. And they will say Bitcoin is not backed by anything real. It's not a commodity asset backed. And my argument is that hadith does not mean what they think it means. That hadith specifically refers to exchanging something that may be considered money, spot, hand to hand. In other words, no ribah, no excess is allowed. It's not specifying that only those 6 types of commodities may be money. In fact, anything may be money. Anything that society deems to be a medium of exchange or a store of value can be money. For example, if you are in a World War II prisoner of war camp, money would be cigarettes. That's how you would trade with each other. That's what was available. If you lived on an island in the Pacific Ocean 100 years ago, your money might be seashells or beads, right? It's not a very good form of money, because as soon as a European ship arrives carrying a cargo of 100 tons of beads, suddenly your money supply is inflated and it's worthless, right? So it's not a great form of money, but it may be used as money on that island until those Europeans arrive. So, whatever society deems by social custom to be money may be money. However, I think gold is a particularly good form of money. I think historically it has precedent. It's difficult to extract from the ground. It has a high, what's called stock to flow ratio. In other words, there's a lot of stock of it in the ground, but there's only a small flow of it coming out of the ground at 1% per annum. So that makes it a good form of money. It means it doesn't devalue over time. In fact, if you did some research on that, you'd be able to work out, based on hadith from 1400 years ago, the value of livestock, say a sheep or a goat, in grams of gold is roughly equivalent to the value of livestock today in the same grams of gold, meaning gold is a stable currency. But there's a problem. So when the BRICS countries get together and they say, let's say they said, okay, we're now going to create a new currency, monetary block, and we're going to use gold as the backing of this currency. In theory, I think that sounds great. In practice, gold is very impractical. We can't carry it around. Maybe you could argue, well, we've all got mobile phones these days, so we could have a certificate that shows how much gold we actually own in a depository somewhere. But now you've introduced counterparty risk, intermediary risk, third-party risk. Now you have to trust intermediaries to handle things correctly. For example, if I go and buy on a stock exchange somewhere today a gold fund, what they call an ETF, exchange-traded fund, it's like buying a share on a stock exchange, and it's backed by gold. At least they tell me it's backed by gold. If I were to go to the vaults of those institutions and say, I have this certificate in my hand which shows I own X amount of gold, please open the vault and show me my gold, they won't do it, because many of those ETFs are not actually backed 1-for-1. In many cases, they've sold that certificate many times over. And I don't trust those institutions. I know because I've worked in those institutions. I know exactly how they work. They will do whatever they can to try and get away with to make as much money as possible. Profit maximization is their religion. So if I have to introduce a third party to custody my gold, I'm already at a disadvantage. That's one of the reasons why, although in theory, I do like the idea of gold and it has historic precedent and it's a sound form of money, in practice, I would require trusted intermediaries. I would require central banks to do what they do, and I don't trust central banks and governments to do the right thing. It couldn't be a peer-to-peer transaction. We couldn't exchange gold between ourselves because we'd have to go through intermediaries. So there are many flaws there. It's better than fiat currency, I'll give you that, but there are still flaws. And that's why I believe in a peer-to-peer currency.
So can we then potentially say that the currency itself would inherently be Islamic, but because it would fuel the same sort of financial system that we currently have with a lot of these instruments and, just a layer over layer of some sort of an MLM or a Ponzi scheme on top. So inherently it would lead to the same outcome that creates that sort of boom, bust, crash, overconsumption, all of the things that inherently are plaguing our societies today. And so my next question to you would be, again, before we go to the Bitcoin part, because I feel like that's the future, right? But I want to understand the present right now. Do you think the current debt-based system is sustainable? Like, is there any way? Because the way that I see it, you can accelerate or decelerate the crash, but a crash will always come. Like, there's just absolutely no way, because it is not optimized. It is not, I was just looking at this very interesting chart where in 1971, when the gold peg was taken off, the productivity kept on rising, whereas the compensation sort of, plateaued. And so in such systems, when you're able to, again, do quack economics where you can fool the public or fool a segment of the public, inequality is inherently going to grow. And every time in history when inequality has grown to a certain point, society goes through major upheavals. And so it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. A bunch of people have a bunch of different theories. Some would say next year, some would say 50 years from now. But eventually, humanity will, that's my opinion, but humanity will eventually have to pay for the excesses that we're taking right now because of the debt-based system. What are your thoughts on that?
So as you were saying that, I started thinking of something called the Law of Jubilee. It's actually recorded in the Bible. And in the 5th century BC, the governor of Judea, Nehemiah, I think, instituted a law called the Law of Jubilee. And every Sabbath year, every 7th year, he would make sure that all debt slaves, debt peons, would be returned to their families. So, of course, you have these societies where debt has proliferated, the financiers have lent money, and collateral is demanded by those financiers. They say, what collateral? If you can't offer your assets, then you offer your family or yourself as a slave in case you can't pay your debt. And of course, if there's too much debt in society and too many debt slaves, what happens? They overcome the number of free people in society and they overthrow them. So a ruler has to be very wise to this and say, okay, I've got to make sure I don't get overthrown by the slaves. I don't want a revolution happening. So every 7 years, I will have a law that says the debt slaves, the debt peons are returned to their families. And I was thinking of this as you were saying this because, as we create a society in which debt is incentivized, in which cheap money is incentivized, you create a society of economic dependency. And here in the UK, for example, anyone who wants to go to university has to take out a massive loan that they will pay over maybe decades of their lifetime to go to university. It's a scam. When I went to university in the early 90s, only 10 to maybe 15% of young people went to university. So university was at the time seen as a sort of academic peak. And then Tony Blair came along and he said, I want to make sure that 50% of young people go to university, which in theory sounds great, right? But in practice, what it meant was you have a proliferation of poor quality institutions offering useless, worthless degrees in subjects that are no use to anybody, right? And people are paying £10,000, £9,000 per year as a local student to go to these universities for 3 or 4 years, plus accommodation, plus maintenance costs, plus buying books, plus living expenses. They're easily racking up £50,000, £60,000 as a student. It's a huge number. They'll pay that off over their lifetime. For what? What benefit did it actually give them? This is an example of creating economic dependency. It's perfect for financial institutions. It's perfect to create a society in which we all become debt slaves. We're all paying half of our monthly net income after tax into repaying some debt, whether it's our house or our car or our mobile phone contract or our student loan. What kind of society is that? So I mean, I think that we're in a situation where we've created this borrow, spend, consume model. And I think that there's a solution to get away from that. I think the reason why we've created boom-bust cycles is because we've inflated the money supply. So some people will argue, well, the fact that you can issue new money is a good thing because it means you can cope with crises like COVID, like a depression or recession. And I would argue, why did that depression or recession happen in the first place? Right? It happened in the first place because you created inequality and the financial system collapsed. I'm of the opinion that, the global economy is a bit like a heroin addict and we keep feeding him methadone and somehow he's still alive, but it's just getting worse and worse. And I have this awful feeling of dread that it's going to collapse and it's going to be even bigger than 2007, 2008. So personally, I'm a risk-averse person, by the way. People say, oh, Bitcoiners, they're speculative gamblers. No, I'm the exact opposite. I'm a risk-averse person, right? I fear the worst and I prepare for the worst. And for me, asset classes like gold and Bitcoin are hedges against financial Armageddon. They're there to protect me from the worst case scenario. So if the global economy crashes, which I happen to think it has a reasonable chance of doing so based on the fundamental factors that I see, then what's going to survive in that? Initially, everything will go down. Everything. Stocks, bonds, real estate, gold, silver, copper, all commodities. They'll all collapse in value. Bitcoin will collapse in value. That's a surety. Initially. But then certain asset classes will begin to come back when people realize that these are stores of value, long-term value. Gold always has been a long-term store of value. So that's a natural thing to hold in the event of a collapse. But I happen to think that Bitcoin has even better characteristics than gold. That's why I believe it's a risk-averse hedge against financial Armageddon.
Interesting. A lot of people, so talking about Bitcoin, a lot of people have a problem with the extreme volatility. So if you look at Bitcoin as a currency, it's very problematic. I buy Bitcoin today, and tomorrow, let's say, it just loses $5,000 in value, and suddenly I've lost a lot of my net worth or my productivity that I have stored in that sort of store of value. How do you reconcile with that aspect of it?
That's a very good point. And actually, that's one of the arguments that scholars will use, theologians will use, and say, the ones who say Bitcoin is haram, they often use the argument that it's volatile, therefore it's gambling or it's uncertain. Gharar and maisir, uncertainty and speculation. What I would say to that is, first of all, if you're investing in a startup company, that's also speculation of a sort, right? How does any company start? When you invest initially in a startup company, you may lose all your money. That's the most form of volatility you can have, minus 100%, right? You can also make a lot of money. We're at a relatively early stage of Bitcoin's evolution, right? We're just over a decade into this experiment. And yes, it's an experiment. I don't know if it's going to be successful, but I'd prefer to believe in a world with Bitcoin than without Bitcoin. If we just use the philosophical tools of argument and do a thought experiment and say, what does a world look like which has Bitcoin as a type of money and which doesn't have Bitcoin as a type of money? What do those two worlds look like? And when you examine it dispassionately and you argue for and against, you start to realize I would rather prefer a world which has a sound form of money. Now, let's talk about volatility. Over time, the volatility of Bitcoin has decreased massively. We're tending towards a steady state equilibrium. So, for example, the volatility of Bitcoin today is no more than big tech stocks. If you were investing in the NASDAQ, Google, Microsoft, etc., you get the same level of volatility, by the way. And that's just mathematical.
And
right?
if it keeps on growing, let's say Bitcoin to 1 million, the percentage volatility will really become...
Exactly. And that's exactly what the charts are showing us. In fact, now, if you look at any 3-year period of Bitcoin's history, any three-year period in the last sort of, decade and a half or so, it's not lost money. So that period is decreasing over time. It's on a long-term upward trend. it's always appreciating versus the dollar, which we think is the hardest form of currency today, the soundest form of money today, but it's always appreciating versus the dollar. I never look at Bitcoin on a day-to-day basis. I don't think that makes any sense. I'm not a day trader. I don't trade stocks and bonds and whatever on a day-to-day basis. I look at my portfolio once a year, and I think on a 20-year basis when I retire. That's how I look at things. So if people are looking at it from then they're speculating, then they're gambling. If they're looking at the vast majority of retail traders who day trade will lose money, okay? Especially if they're looking at crypto in general. I don't believe in crypto. I only believe in Bitcoin because I see Bitcoin as a future form of money. You're quite right that, as a form of money today, if I was using it peer-to-peer to buy and sell goods and services, sure, on a day-to-day basis, it is volatile and it's not quite ready to be a daily usage medium of exchange, but I think it is ready to be a store of value now.
I think it's really about how you approach the currency to begin with. I think you gave a very interesting example of buying a goat with gold, let's say 1,000 years ago, and buying a goat today in gold. And I think what a lot of people really miss is they're always looking at, which I feel like is the un-Islamic and the annoying part, is where you really see numbers as investments, as multiplying wealth. For me, Bitcoin would be a way to hedge my productivity. So I work hard and I'm productive and I've made some value. I store that value either in dollars, which are going to sort of burn itself and eventually my value will deflate, or I store that value in Bitcoin and it will retain itself against the dollar, which is basically, so it's not really Bitcoin rising, it's really all other currencies losing their value.
Absolutely. Very well put. That's exactly the way that Bitcoiners look at it. They don't look at Bitcoin being volatile. They look at everything else being volatile. And Bitcoin is rising against those. They're depreciating against. That's how they see it. So I think that's very well put. In fact, I would urge people, especially in Pakistan, it's an economically troubled country for many, many years. And when you look at places like Lebanon, Gaza, Bitcoin has become a lifeline for people in those countries. Literally, I mean, it's saving lives. I approached a scholar, a very well-known scholar in Pakistan. I won't name him, but they were, somewhat known to and associated with the regime in Afghanistan. And when the Taliban came back to power in Afghanistan, I asked this individual, don't you think we should be advising them to protect their citizens' wealth, to make sure that they can afford to build infrastructure in their country, that they can build hospitals and schools and roads and railways by choosing a sound form of currency? And I gave the specific example of the money that was frozen in US banks. If you remember, about $7 billion of Afghani reserves was frozen in US banks when the Taliban came back to power. Now, that's theft. So as much as people in the West like to say they are the free world and they believe in justice and equality and all this kind of nonsense they say, the reality is if they don't like you, they will turn you into economic slaves, whether that's through the IMF or the World Bank, and they'll introduce austerity programs and say you need to do this in your constitution and you need to live your lives the way we live our lives because our culture is superior. That's what they're imposing on you. This is a form of cultural imperialism. And they will freeze your money. And when they freeze your money, they starve your people. So they're quite happy to murder your population because they don't like your government. That's not freedom at all. And what I recommended to this scholar was, why don't we talk to them about a form of money that cannot be manipulated by third parties, that cannot be censored and sanctioned by third parties, that cannot be stolen by third parties if you self-custody. Some people will say, oh yeah, but exchanges get hacked all the time. But don't store it on an exchange. Self-custody, that's the beauty of peer-to-peer currency. So his response to me was very telling. He said to me, oh, this Bitcoin, it's all very well, but, don't you think that we should be teaching them about Islamic banking first? I said, whoa, forget about this. This is a waste of my time.
This brings me to my next question. Why do you think, there are a lot of scholars, very famous, that rubber stamp. Everybody, whenever they talk about Islamic banking, more often than not, and that's the sad part, is in the age of information, more and more people are not really going out there and educating themselves. What they tend to do is they're like, oh, I don't know, this is really confusing, but this, sort of alim and Mufti Saab has said this, and based on this, I will now make all of my financial decisions. And so again, a lot of these Sharia compliant Islamic banking, Islamic finance situations that are happening are more often than not rubber stamped by, and I'm not saying they're bad or they're corrupt or whatever, but, these sort of powerful Islamic scholars. Why do you think have they been unable to understand the core fundamentals? Like on a very fundamental level, you're really breaking it down, right? You can't create fiat currency. You can't have fractional reserve banking system. You can't have a debt-based system that is going to incentivize consumption more than it incentivizes productivity, right? And that's what we're seeing in Pakistan. The boom bust cycles are always driven by consumption. You get some money and then you import a bunch of goods to consume. You lower the interest rates, and now the rich or the upper middle class and above, have their new cars and their new laptops and their new whatever, and then you're out of money. Whereas if it was an Islamic form of or Islamic economic system, people wouldn't, when they'd be lending you money, they'd be like, why do you want a new house? Why don't you go and start a business? Why don't you export or do this or do that? And so automatically the capital, without any government intervention, would essentially directly start to find its way towards efficiency and productivity. But that doesn't happen. And so all these Islamic countries keep on, keep themselves in the imperial, like under the slavery of the imperial empire, whatever that is, right? Why do you think that is vis-a-vis the scholars?
So I want to be really clear on the scholars. I have the utmost respect for them. I have worked with many of the world's leading scholars. Some names like Mufti Taqi Usmani, Dr. Dawood Bakr, Sheikh Hussain Hamid Hasan, these are, their intellects are, mashallah, impeccable. Their integrity is impeccable. These are good people. I actually sincerely believe that. And in fact, if you talk to the majority of those who are qualified in fiqh al-mu'amalat, which is the jurisprudence of commercial transactions, these are the scholars who opine on Islamic finance transactions, you will tend to find an opinion from them, which is that financial instruments that have been deemed halal today through Islamic banks, for example, are always deemed to be so in context. So they're not halal for all time and all places. They're halal for this time and this place in this setting. And that's really important, actually, because here I want to defend them, right? And I appreciate that some people do feel that, they appear to rubber stamp something that inherently can't be compliant. It doesn't make any sense. It's an oxymoron, Islamic banking. And yet I want to defend them because they're very smart people. They understand the environment, the economic environment that we live in. They know that everything is essentially touched by riba. There's no getting away from that in today's economy. And it isn't really their job to innovate new financial techniques and products and services. Their job is to uphold the Sharia as it stands today. And sometimes they perform ijtihad to do that. So in a sense, I don't blame them for being a little bit slow on the uptake here. And I don't blame them for continuing to uphold Islamic banking as the example of what we should be doing. Because I think that they're not the people who are there to innovate for us. It's actually financiers, people like me, practitioners, who are there to invent new products and then convince the people and the scholars that this is something wholesome that we should all be using. So there I want to defend them. They have said what they have said because they see no alternative. And I don't blame them for not having that vision. That's, in a sense, not entirely their fault. But I am seeing some young scholars come up now, by the way, who are at the coalface they're right in the middle of the industry itself, working with practitioners to create new products. And that's a very exciting development, by the way. Those are lesser known names. They're not global brand names like Mufti Taqi Usmani.
But they're essentially the brand names of the future, right? They're the ones who are building the blocks.
So. Yes, I hope so. Yeah.
If I were to ask you, again, zooming out a little bit, we've spoken about, you spoke about IMF coming to Pakistan 24 times, and they've done that quite a few times. I want to talk about the financial system as a whole, and dollar as a reserve currency. There's that aspect happening there as well. And again, so a lot of these Islamic finance and economic systems and banking, for me, this was a revelation of the last 24 months where I was studying any and everything, and I realized it's all of it is connected one way or the other, and it's all driven by power and greed and, again, so in terms of when I studied the US economy, in Pakistan, we're constantly looking at, what are we exporting and then what are we importing, and then we have a current account deficit. So we're not, if you take out the numbers, you're not producing enough, so you can't consume enough as well. And that's going to change the costs and make things difficult. You look at the US, the productivity really hasn't grown. They've been in current account deficit for the longest time. And seemingly they're the world's largest market. Like everybody wants to export to the US. And you realize when you zoom out enough that basically US has been absorbing the world's productivity and basically subsidizing it for its consumers, when in actuality, again, it's not driven by fundamentals. They're not producing enough to give back to the world. And I feel like there were a few mistakes that they've made along the way, where the Ukraine-Russia war, and even the Afghan cash, when they started blocking cash, they started blocking people out of the banking system. A lot of the countries got spooked. And so now we're increasingly hearing from the BRICS nations, otherwise as well, countries are now deleveraging themselves from the US, and they're trying to protect themselves. And, we're now increasingly hearing headlines of a dollar collapse and this and that and so on and so forth. I don't want your prediction on whether that's going to happen, how long that's going to take. But what I want to understand is, if you've studied all of that, what would you say for a country like Pakistan? Because small developing nations, more often than not, they're very inward looking. They're not really looking at what's happening around the world. And a great example for that would be recently Pakistan has a gold mine called Reko Diq. And there's news that they might be selling that 15% of that. The gold mine apparently has reserves of $800 billion in today's price of gold and copper. And they're probably selling it for $1 billion, $1.5 billion, 15% of that share to the Saudis. And for me, that doesn't make any sense at a time when dollar is under extreme stress, and there's a lot of potential that dollar will go down and gold and copper will rise. The Saudis are basically just going to dump a few treasuries, which they know are going to devalue anyways, and they're getting a mine for the next 40 years. And so for me, the reason why this transaction doesn't make sense is because the policymakers aren't looking outwards, they're just looking inwards, right? In terms of this system that has existed for the past, let's say, at least 30, 40 years, but since US has been the sole superpower, but at least from 1971, do you think that system is changing? And how would that impact the global South and Muslim countries like Bangladesh or Pakistan? What are your thoughts on that?
So this is way above my pay grade to answer this. Geopolitics is not my specialism. I can only speak as a human being. And what I see happening in Pakistan is an absolute tragedy. And here I'm going to reveal my own personal politics. Pakistan is very sadly a country, in my opinion, that is run by criminals. And they themselves have a slave mentality. They're happy to be ruled by foreign interests. And as long as they have this slave mentality, Pakistan will not succeed. I think we'll have to go through a bit of pain to become a economically better nation. Again, I say this as a non-expert. So in a sense, I feel like a fraud, giving you my opinion on this. From a financial perspective, I do believe that the US is a ticking time bomb. They are being outplayed by China right now, massively outplayed. China is so far ahead on certain industries like EVs, for example. Their education system. They are not bound by so-called woke policies. They say that good times create weak men. I think that's what's happening in the US right now. And I think that other nations will occupy a vacuum that will be vacated by the US very soon. Who knows when? I don't have a crystal ball. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I don't have a good handle on the geopolitics of it. But I think it is incumbent on a nation like Pakistan to prepare for that eventuality if it happens. And I think there is no better way to prepare than to build up reserves of sound money. Now, sound money might be gold, it might be Bitcoin. I really do urge Pakistanis in general to get on both of those as soon as they can. If you can, convert a small portion of your monthly income. Keep saving it up. Because if that financial Armageddon does happen, Pakistani will suffer. And you want to protect the citizens' wealth. And you need to protect it in such a way that it cannot be stolen by criminals. And the government is the biggest bunch of criminals there are. So make sure you do not custody on an exchange. Not your keys, not your coins is the phrase that Bitcoiners use. That means you must own your own private encryption keys. Now, I've said a few technical things there. I appreciate not many people will understand that.
But at least they have a direction. They can start sort of reading up on it.
Yeah, I hope that they do because, I may not be Pakistani by birth. I was born in the UK, but people ask me, what are you? And I say, look, my head is British, but my heart is Pakistani. And the heart is more important than the head. So I really feel for what's happening in Pakistan right now. And I want to warn people, this is what's coming for you. God, I don't know how this is going to end. You got a man in jail who is, I think, the only person I believe who has the right heart and the right intention for the people of Pakistan. And I pray for his release and I pray for his safety. But you never know what will happen in the future. And I urge the Pakistani people to protect themselves economically, because if you become economically strong, then you have social and political influence. So get rich and share your wealth.
I think, so my perspective on Pakistan, or at least the geopolitics of it, is I feel like the criminals, as you mentioned, have always been given patronage from somewhere. It's always money that allows for control. And I think I actually look at all of this in a more optimistic way, because I feel like when you're already rock bottom, you can't really go any further, right? And so even if there is a crash, and even if Pakistanis haven't been able to sustain or create wealth, at least the patronage will die out, and at least we will have a few years of vacuum period where there will be chaos, but from that chaos we'll come up with something. And I've been studying other economies like Indonesia and Turkey, and a lot of these countries really fixed themselves when the economic collapse has happened and really the patronage stopped. And more so, I feel like with the reason why I asked you about the US is, and again, this is me asking you as an investment banker, because I know investment bankers really look at all of this stuff, but if US is absorbing a lot of the productivity of the world, and if, let's assume that it no longer has the ability, because of a devalued dollar or whatever, to be able to absorb that. I was talking to Fidelity International's head of investments, and he said that if Trump puts up the duties that he's threatening to put up, US is basically going to consume $200 billion less of the goods that it currently imports in, right? Do you think that once that productivity eases from the US, that is going to start going towards the rest of the world? I don't know if that makes sense, but in my head, what I'm thinking is things are expensive because someone is printing money and just taking it away. The world is producing the same amount of stuff, right? If the US is not buying it, it has to be consumed by someone else. It's going to go to Africa. It's going to go to some other parts of Asia. And so the global south or the rest of the world might start, absorbing some of that productivity and growing faster.
This is why we're seeing the influence of China in Africa, for example, wherever there are huge mineral reserves or, metal reserves, they are getting in there, because this is a similar situation to Saudi. who entered into a 50-year agreement with the US to buy their goods and services and invest in their bonds for exchange of oil. So, that's a resource-rich country, at the very early stage of its evolution, buying goods and services from the US. And now we're seeing a new world order emerging. So why not? Why not have that situation reversed and have another country like China act in the same position? Pakistan has been negotiating that very tricky equation for some years now. Again, I don't know where it's going to end up. I'm not a geopolitical analyst. But I see that as being a very complex game playing out.
Makes sense. I'm going to wrap this up. We're at the 1 hour mark. I want to understand, you've already given one piece of suggestion to Pakistanis in terms of, right now we're in a turbulent time. There's economics-wise, even socially, there's a lot of upheaval all over the world. I remember just a few weeks ago, we were looking at the UK, and I remember I called my friend and I was like, "Are you okay?" And he was like, "I left Pakistan so that I wouldn't receive these calls," right? And now they're happening in the UK as well. But beyond that, beyond just Bitcoin or gold, for your viewers in Pakistan, what would you suggest? What would your thoughts be, when they sort of maneuver through this cycle, if you may call it? Because people are extremely hopeless right now, and they don't see light at the end of tunnels. And I do understand that, particularly for young people. Pakistan has a lot of young people. If this is what they've been seeing for the past 4 or 5 years, this is a large part of their living memory. You've seen cycles, you've seen peaks, you've seen drops. What would you tell Pakistanis?
Well, let me tell you something. There's a lot of optimism. The young people of Pakistan are incredibly dynamic, very impressive, mashallah. I visited a few years ago when I was setting up a so-called incubator or accelerator in the UK. What I mean by that, it's basically a workspace and consulting environment where you invite a lot of startup companies together and build whatever product it is that they're building, usually a tech-related product. And I went to Pakistan to see how their incubators and accelerators worked. And my God, I was blown away. They were so high quality. The people were so impressive. The young people had incredible ideas, not just incredible ideas, but they were able to execute on those ideas. They were able to actually put them. That's the key, by the way. Everybody can have an idea, but if you can't implement the idea, it doesn't mean anything. So they actually were able to forge their ideas in the crucible of the marketplace, make it something real and tangible and sellable to customers. And I saw intelligence, hard work, dynamism, gave me huge optimism for the future. I think Pakistan's all right, inshallah. Honestly, I sincerely believe it. I think that there is a generation of highly educated, hardworking young people who are creating, for example, fintech companies, financial technology companies. And if they can marry those concepts and those ideas to a real economy, risk-sharing economic model, that's fantastic. I hope they can do that. And I'm looking forward to them doing that.
Makes sense. Can you tell me a little, before you go, can you tell me a little bit about what Cordoba Capital does?
Yeah. So we created a subsidiary called CCM, which is Cordoba Capital Markets. And the idea is that having worked in the banking industry for so long, trying to produce these non-debt risk-sharing Islamic products and realizing that banks just can't get away from that. They have to bring it back to debt. There's a type of product in Islamic banking called sukuk. Sukuk means Islamic bond. So a bond, of course, is a type of a loan that you list on an exchange and it pays an interest rate. So you're a big company and you want to raise $100 million or $1 billion on an exchange. You're basically borrowing from the capital market. So thousands of investors are investing in your loan, and these are listed on an exchange. A sukuk was meant to be an Islamic version of that. And what we did 20 years ago with Deutsche Bank, we invented these sukuk, which were basically asset-backed. So they weren't loans. They were supposed to be a participation in a real asset, like real estate that generates a rental income. And that means that rental income is a bit like the coupon that you pay on a bond, an interest rate, except it's real. It's something that comes from the activity. Of course, it was never like that. The bankers made it end up looking exactly like a bond. So I've gone back to basics. I've gone back 1400 years to the roots of trade. What was the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam? He was a mudarib, a manager of people's capital. So his first wife gives him capital to manage, and he sends a caravan outside the city walls to trade whatever it is, spices, textiles, etc., brings it back, trades in the marketplace, makes a profit, splits it with his investor, right? He's a mudarib. That arrangement is called a mudaraba, an investment management agreement. This is pure trade. This is pure Islamic finance, going back to the roots of Islamic finance, of the economic model, not what banks do. So now the investor and the investee, the two, the manager and the investor, they have to do due diligence together on this venture. What are we going to do with this money? What are we going to buy and sell? What are the risks involved? How do we mitigate those risks? How do we share the profits? I have converted that fundamental concept of mudaraba into a financial instrument called a PPN, a profit participating note. So it is like a sukuk, except it's truly risk sharing. You share the profits and losses of a specific trade activity.
Interesting. So essentially anyone can buy it. So if I come to the UK and I decide, I want to buy one of these, so is it like available like a stock that I can?
Right. Yeah, we're listing it on a stock exchange. Exactly. There's a slight spanner in the works in that at the moment we only have regulatory approval to bring professional investors. So one day I would like to have retail investors as well.
What would be the difference here? Well,
So
who would be a professional investor versus a retail? I understand, but what about
professional investors are typically institutions, family offices with millions of dollars in liquid net wealth, and they must invest at least $100,000 in each instrument.
Right. So it's really the ticket size that's basically
correct. Exactly right. Yes.
Interesting. And so basically, what you're saying is it's essentially private equity, but done in a more accessible way.
Without debt, correct.
Without debt.
Yeah.
Do you think this same thing outside of the whole regulatory environment, or could within the regulatory environment maybe, but do you think in the future, do you see the whole initial coin offerings happening to come out in a similar model where I can just go out there and instead of buying shares, I buy coins of companies where they have some sort of an agreement in place of profits and losses, and then the coin itself has value driven by all of that. Or, for example, if I have to raise capital, what I'm trying to understand is, if someone wants to, I came to Dubai last year, and going around, I saw people just selling apartment after apartment after apartment. It's crazy speculative bubble. Beyond the bubble, what I was looking at was, again, it's rich people having the access to get more rich, because, first a bunch of rich people would come together, buy land, and then they would sell to slightly less, but still very rich people, apartments.
Make profit and move on.
Yeah. And it didn't, and I looked at the land price, I looked at the entire project size, and I was like, this is 10,000 people investing a very small chunk each.
Yeah.
Why can't we give this sort of access to someone in Pakistan, for example, or anywhere else in the world? Because I don't know if you saw the report, Pakistanis bought $10 billion worth of real estate in the last 3-4 years. That is like 4 times what IMF is supposed to give us this year, right? So it's mind-numbing, and it's also driven by the top 1%. And so if they can do it, why can't the rest of the population do it? And so there, again, for me, I could really see a vision of a lot of these, ICOs and Bitcoin really making sense, where it's the great equalizer.
Yeah. I had exactly the same vision. And the reason why I couldn't go down the tokenization route, which is the ICOs that you're talking about, was because the platform providers, the people who offer these electronic exchanges for tokenized offerings of these investments, which democratizes finance in theory, were not professional enough for me. That was the reason I didn't go with them. I think in time, they will get better. I had to go down the traditional route of setting up a so-called protected sell company in Jersey, and the traditional legal agreements and so on, and regulations for professional investors and so on. Because at the time that I set it up, a couple of years ago, I didn't see a requisite level of professionalism from the digital asset providers, the tokenization platforms. I hope very soon we can democratize what we're doing so that all investors can buy it with $1. If they just want to invest $1, I would like to be able to offer that. But I can't do it until those platform providers have really upped their game in terms of their quality.
Makes sense. Because I feel like, when I look at all the freelancers in Pakistan, a bunch of them have like $5,000 sitting in a wallet somewhere, getting burnt by the US inflation that could just easily be routed to something more productive. Haris, this was extremely, extremely insightful. Thank you so much for taking the time out. And I hope, with good feedback, if we get requests from people, I hope you'll consider coming back again in the future.
I'll do my best. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And for all of you guys, thank you so much for watching. अगर आपको ये एपिसोड पसंद आई हो तो दोस्तों यार जरूर शेयर करिएगा. नीचे कमेंट सेक्शन में मुझे आके बताएं व्हाट डू यू थिंक अबाउट इस्लामिक फाइनेंस, इस्लामिक इकोनॉमिक सिस्टम. आजकल का जो हमारा सिस्टम चल रहा है, बैंक्स, फ्रैक्शनल रिजर्व बैंकिंग, इन तमाम चीज़ों के बारे में आपका क्या ख्याल है? आपको अगर लगता है कि ये चीज़ें हराम है तो क्या आप इसमें पार्टिसिपेट करते हैं? हाउ डू यू विगल अराउंड इट? हाउ डू यू सी द फ्यूचर? आई वुड लव टू रीड योर कमेंट्स. But anyways, this was Muzamil Hasan Zaidi. You're watching Thought Behind Things. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.